feel and the ways that that affection is actively manifested. That is to say that some people are more emotive in the love that they experience, where some people are more passionate in the love that they experience and project upon others. Secondly, affection was just displayed in a very different way as a result of these things. That was to say that people express their affection by doing things like buying gifts for their partners or by talking intimately with their partners. It was onerous to expect that one person was able to provide all of these sources of emotive love to people, meaning that most people under traditional relationships as we knew them weren't able to be in engaging and fulfilled relationships that encompassed all the dimensions of love that might be available to them. But the third thing to note as to what love looks like is that it was just particularly onerous to expect one person to provide these things over such a long period of time as a relationship or a marriage is expected to go from. That is to say, someone is inherently extraordinarily different when they are 20 to when they are 80, and traditional marriage often forces people to stay in those relationships even when the love languages spoken by each individual partner or spouse becomes very different. That was something that was particularly pernicious, and that was something that locked people out of experiencing true love in a way that we thought would be fulfilling. Third thing I want to talk about in this speech is the issues that we see with traditional relationships and why those were particularly harmful. This is pretty significant. 5 things to talk about there. I think there are 2 different ways that relationships play out depending on what parts of the world you live in, say, or what like socioeconomic area you live in. But I think firstly, in terms of a lot of like more well-off countries, we often see relationships break down inherently. And we thought that that was something that had disseminated effects that harmed like anyone who was involved with that relationship. That was any children that were involved were often having to go through hefty sort of divorce payments or settlements that were going on that their parents were involved with that harmed their development in pernicious ways. The second thing to say about traditional relationships is often, and marriage especially, was just an archaic device. It was imbued upon shitty norms in the first place. That was to say it lent into things like the woman having to be the provider of the family and attached and ascribed such a role to those individuals, which particularly plays out in conservative societies. That was to note that even if in the modern day we don't see a marriage as, you know, binding a woman to a man, the remnants of that arrangement still, you know, takes its form in weddings as we see them, and is still something that is particularly harmful. No, thank you. The third thing I want to note is that these traditional relationships are erroneous insofar as they just encourage possessiveness between partners. That is to say, at the point where you have one person and that one person is your person, and also that happens on the other side, it means that any time that you become suspicious that maybe your spouse is doing something with anyone else, even if that might be unfounded, the possessiveness that marriage, say, entails often means that it manifests in a particularly harmful way. The fourth reason that traditional relationships are particularly bad, and this often takes place in more conservative societies whereby people are locked into marriage through forced marriage arrangements, say, or even in the Western world in poorer communities where you get toxic relationships that exist, where people become dependent on their partner. And often this was something that was weaponized by social norms because it was seen as a big deal if you were to divorce your partner, even if your partner was addicted to drugs, even if your partner was absolutely terrible to you every single night. And it was difficult to withdraw from those relationships because of the way that we viewed traditional relationships as they existed. The fifth thing to note with an issue with traditional relationships is just the codependence they inherently imbued. That was to say, when you tied yourself to one person in particular, often your financial dependency became solely contingent on that person and that person alone's practices, when you often didn't have a great deal of sway over what that person did. But moreover, we just thought the extent to which people became codependent on one another probably wasn't useful for those people. They'd probably be better if they could maintain their own financial security, or if there was bigger net of people that only polyamorous relationships will provide. Fourth thing I want to talk about is why polyamorous relationships are likely to be more stable. 4 things to cover here. Firstly, I think inherently by the topic, insofar as there's informed consent of parties, you need to have discussions with your partners such as to get that consent in the first place. At the point where partners, and a wide range of them, are talking, it's likely to be something that's useful. The second thing to note is when you have more partners, you inherently have more connections and more support networks you can lean on, to the extent that you know, there are several people now that you have a romantic involvement with, you're intimate with, they probably know more about you, they're probably more able to support you during difficult times. I'll take a POI from closing if you have one.
Taken.
Can't hear.
Literally nothing came through my microphone. I don't know if that's a technical issue or if nothing was actively said. I don't know. I wasn't able to speak during that time. Anyways, the fourth thing to note as to why traditional polyamorous relationships will be more stable is because the third reason, is it will allow people to exit toxic relationships. If you have more partners, you have more vehicles to sort of ride on at the point where you exit those relationships. It's not going to be seen as weird. And the fourth thing to note is it's particularly stable in the context of children. That is to say, you won't be forced to stay in toxic relationships because you think you have to raise a kid together. But moreover, you have a larger pool of people to draw from as role models when you're growing up as a kid. Final thing I want to say is why this is good for gender issues and LGBT things, noting that a lot of my analysis has already proved many of these things. That is to say, women being pulled out of a lot of particularly pernicious relationships that they've been drawn into, and especially becoming more financial codependent. But two things to say here. Firstly, on women, now they're able to pursue their own financial identity at the point where in conservative societies, they're not thrust into a caregiver role inherently. But the second thing to note with regards to LGBT people is it provides more capacity for experimentation to those people without being written off as being sort of a different person in society, which was particularly harmful. That's why polyamorous relationships were always going to be better than traditional relationships, which were so harmful. Thank you.
I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue their case within 7 minutes. Here.
Can everyone hear?
Yep, go ahead.
Here. Start.
I think the fact that our opposition in this debate has chosen to take the worst possible case of literal harems as the case that they want to engage with is indicative that actual polyamory is really good, is much better than the status quo, and that what we spoke about in our Prime Minister's speech continues to go uncontested. What I'm going to do in this speech is talk about, first of all, why this is better for people in relationships, and then I'll talk about other stakeholders or society more broadly. Firstly, with regards to people in relationships, I want to begin by rebutting the stuff that we heard about like polygamy and the kind of sexist norms that would trap multiple women in a marriage with like one man. I think that this is not in this debate for the reason that the topic says polyamory is having more than one partner. What that means is you can't have one guy who has more than one partner, but each of those women are unable to have multiple partners. It means that everyone in the relationship has the option of mutually deciding to go have other partners. So I think this is clearly a distinct relationship type from that of the kind of polygamy. I think that that was pretty uncharitable from the opposition team here. But I'll take that at the best. Like, let's say this was a debate that included polygamy. I think there are a couple of problems here. First of all, obviously polygamous relationships exist in this world as well. It is unclear why they would be particularly more numerous in our world than in the current world, given that people can already opt into polygamous relationships in many countries. They're already relatively common. So I don't think it is the case that that is an exclusive harm to our side. Second of all, it was unclear why those marriages were actually worse than a regular relationship. They tell us, oh, well, you get told, oh, you're just one of his wives, therefore you don't get education. Well, it just seems the case that if you're trapped in a patriarchal society, even if you're the only wife, you're still not allowed to get an education. It's incredibly unclear why that was a particularly egregiously and uniquely egregious harm. Additionally, we thought this topic stipulated that you had to have informed consent. We thought then it was incredibly unlikely that the people in this, well, it was actually just impossible that the people in these relationships would be so completely disempowered, would not know what was going on, would have no power. That is literally not informed consent. The final thing I would say is I think that societies have an innate drive to progress to some extent. I think obviously a lot of societies have increased rights for women over time. I think that that basically fixes this problem in and of itself, as more women in these relationships would ask for more power, would ask for genuine polyamory. Because that is pretty much the only actual characterization we receive from the op in this debate, I think that that is broadly pretty insufficient. And now I'll move on to explaining, or I guess whipping our benefits with regards to relationships. But first I'll take a point from, let's go close.
Taken.
Perfect. So you say that like women's rights would have developed in the exact same way, but in a world where sexism still exists, in a world where homophobia still exists, why would they necessarily have evolved in the way that you want them to versus evolving in a similar way to the status quo, just with polyamory, like heterosexual polyamory?
Similar way to the status quo. The status quo has societies which have developed towards greater liberalism for women. So sure. But second of all, I think there's no reason to believe, no op speaker so far has given me a reason to believe that these societies were sexist and were heteronormative. I think at the point where it's normalized to have multiple partners, where it's normalized not to have one single life partner, those kind of norms are less likely to exist because relationships are not centered on, for instance, having children, on being the single provider. So I thought even those norms were probably just likely. Okay. So why were polyamorous relationships more loving? We give you three main reasons, or I guess three main problems with relationships at the moment. These were, first of all, that there were different love languages and people had different types of affection and preferences and needs. Second of all, we told you some people were better at particular ones than others. And third of all, we told you people changed over time. All of these made conventional relationships incredibly insufficient. Polyamory fixes this because it allowed for flexibility, where if you needed a particular thing at a particular moment, you could go to someone who was good at it. But it also meant you could meet all your needs. And when they tell us, oh, well, you have to make so many sacrifices in a relationship, so this really adds up, I think this is actually a reason to believe that placing all those sacrifices on one person is much worse than being able to spread them out, because it is not the case that everyone in a polyamorous relationship has to sacrifice the same amount as if they were in a monogamous relationship. Rather, you can meet the needs that you are best at, and then that you care most about within that relationship, rather than putting all of that burden on one person who cannot necessarily meet it, for whom that is incredibly frustrating. Second of all, why does this break down bad norms? Note this is responsive to the polygamy stuff. First of all, the idea of permanence and one true love was something that was particularly harmful. It meant people found it harder to escape bad relationships. Second of all, you had less of a support network. In conventional relationships, they tell us, oh, but it's hard to explain, like, if someone's being violent. But those people obviously cared about you because they were in a relationship with you. Thought you were probably more likely to care that someone is beating up your, like, polyamorous wife than just a friend. We thought, obviously there was a genuine connection there, which meant you were much more likely to be supported. Third, jealousy and possessiveness clearly could not exist in a polyamorous world where you had to negotiate communicating with multiple partners and understood that you did not own that person. They compare it to sibling jealousy, which is clearly a different thing to relationship jealousy, where you felt like you kind of owned that person, where you felt like they owed you something. So that still stands. We told you it diminished codependence, which made people far more independent, particularly women. And finally, we told you it gave queer people the opportunity to experiment with their gender and their sexuality in a way which was incredibly empowering. All of those are reasons why this world is generally better for relationships than the alternative. They do not give particularly persuasive reasons as to why current relationships would improve. These are clear reasons why polyamorous relationships would be more loving, would be more supportive, and would break down bad norms. Moving on to other stakeholders and society, the main thing that we hear from opening opposition is about property and how it would be like hard to break up. I think their own reasoning works against them here, because they tell us, but the social structures change. Yes, obviously the social structures change to support polyamorous relationships. Therefore, you will not have a horrible property battle like they want to suggest. You are much more likely to have community-based care for children and community-based finances. And those things, as I've already mentioned, are far more supportive for the participants, far less likely to make you codependent. But also note that this means you have a huge incentive to communicate within those relationships in order to avoid those pitfalls. That was always going to make that relationship stronger. We thought, indeed, for people like children, it was probably good to have more parents and more support and a greater kind of community care network than in a conventional heterosexual relationship. Finally, they tell us, well, what if you don't get any approval from society at large? But obviously, if you find your one person and then you have an agreement that you can have multiple partners, that completely gets around that particular piece and very marginal piece of analysis. At the end of this debate, at the end of this speech, I think it's clear that there are significant flaws with conventional monogamous relationships. I think polyamory obviously gets around with it, and our opposition were completely incapable of engaging with that fairly. Proud to affirm.
Okay, thank you for your speech. I would like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue start the closing half of this debate within 7 minutes here.
All right.
Start.
Madam Chair, side of closing government is going to enter this debate uniquely, because we do not just think about whether or not this debate is about whether or not polygamy is good, but it's about recognizing that humans have an inherent desire for this perfect relationship through which we think that you can ascertain the maximum amount of happiness. But the fact that you will never be able to do so at the point at which you are kept within the shackles of monogamy. That's how we enter this debate in closing government. We're going to tell you exclusively and characterize to you what relationships in the status quo look like, why monogamy radically changes that structure that keeps people in oppression and keeps people from being able to attain happiness. And we're going to extend and talk about why exactly monogamous relationships are so harmful and why we would rather a world where all romantic relationships are consensually polyamorous, right? A few things I'll do in my speech. Number one, into rebuttals. So note, right, that a lot of the things that opening opposition wanted to state were very low impact. So ideas such as, well, now you're going to have a confusing allocation of resources. I think it's extremely not important as compared to something as important as being able to find happiness in the relationships that you seek. Because understand that having an ideal relationship literally defines who you are as an individual. You literally derive your happiness of how your partner feels, because you spend every single minute of your life with that individual, right? Okay, the second thing they wanted to say is that, you will have less meaningful relationships because there are many individuals who are now your partners. I think this is extremely not under-analyzed. They did not tell us exactly how this meaning is attained. But more importantly, we believe that meaning can be found in many different outlets. So there are many different ways in order for you to attain meaning, right? Maybe that's about cherishing how your wife looks. Maybe that's about looking at how your husband is able to do certain things. We think that polyamorous relationships give us that diversity through which we can subscribe to different ideals of what it means to be happy, right? The third thing they said is, now you will feel jealous. I do not think this is important. Opening probably already sufficiently dealt with it. Number one, it's consensual. But number two, understand that society's perceptions are shaped by culture normative ideas. That's to say that at the point at which polyamory is seen as the social norm, we believe that more people will be able to subscribe into this and there'll be less of a stigma on that. In that, we also do not think that you can currently have polyamorous in the status quo because it's so antagonized, right? The last thing to note is that they say, why can't they just be friends? We can have a social network. I will deal with this exclusively in my case because I will tell you about why exactly romantic relationships in and of itself and its inherent value is important in the context of polyamorous relationships. Two extensions I will have, right? The premises of which are similar to OG, but we will extend specifically into how a relationship works and why exactly we take them out of this debate. Number one, polyamory recognizes humans' innate desires and maximizes human fulfillment. Firstly, recognize that all individuals have the innate desire to be happy. That is to say that they can ascertain this happiness through seeking the ideal significant other. The problem with this is that we all have the desire for the ideal other, but this is a lie because no one will perfectly represent who we want to have as a wife or as a husband. It is a lie that's been perpetuated by individuals like on social media, by fairy tale stories, right? That we should spend our lives striving for this relationship, right? The unique importance is that we will never find it, but many individuals think we will. And that's why when they enter a relationship, a monogamous one, they think, I have one shot to get one partner. I cannot screw this up. The problem, this is problematic, is that this will never happen. This will never be true. Why is this harmful? Because after the initial flood of hormones and love emotion fades, you live a life dissatisfied, of perpetual unfulfillment, at which husbands can only be on the constant lookout for the iniquities or shortcomings of their wives, right? That is why we see in many monogamous relationships extremely high rates of divorce, extremely high rates of domestic abuse, because they are unable to view view others from the lens of they can only view others from the lens of what is selfish to them. Why does this change at the outside of the house? We recognize that a polyamorous relationship is able to offer you everything that you would want in a person. Maybe I date date person A because she has nice skills. Maybe I date person B because he has talents that I think I would want in the ideal man. It could be about, looks. It could be literally about anything. It could be about literally even the sex positions that you like. These sorts of things give you different ways in which you can subscribe to that meaning, and are only provided at a point at which you give yourself the ability to subscribe to a diverse set of relationships. But before I continue, opening.
Taken.
So you're just asserting that for all humans, the ideal is to have more than one relationship because they can't overcome the imperfections of their partner? This is ridiculous. I think many people are able to do this in status quo, and they're probably going to do it in polyamorous or amorous relationships. So where's the difference?
Okay, I'm going to take this this argument in its very best and tell you why exactly this is not something that's localized to the individual, but why, second argument, monogamy assaults the functions of society and makes life worse for third parties, right? So that's where I consider wider society. Number one, I think the context is already taken into consideration that monogamy shackles individuals into unmeaningful relationships and dreams themselves of happiness and character, right? Why exactly is this important? Number one, understand that relationships are paramount to your self-identity and how you are able to ascertain individuals as an individual. We believe that how you see your partner every day, when you walk home from work, how you kiss your wife, how you interact with them, determines how happy you are as an individual. But notice, right, that this is extremely harmful, because at the point at which, and this is very common, when monogamous relationships go wrong, you have vast impacts that impact all sorts of individuals. Number one, I think it looks at children having to grow up in a household with parents who are fighting, because the dad cannot have a separate outlet. He doesn't have someone else to air his grievances with, and therefore is unable to provide like a nurturing home for his son. But secondly, right, domestic abuse. OG flashed this out. We'll analyze this. Number three reasons why. Number one, I think a wife in a relationship is going to feel isolated at a point at which they do not have other people to talk to. Wanted to say you can just talk to friends. I do not think that this is realistic, because you have to talk about many intimate details that you might not necessarily share, right? The key those sorts of things. But note, right, also that there's a key nuance, that you are only going to break up from your relationship at the point at which it becomes very, very bad. That's the point at which you have domestic abuse. So this time frame in and of itself is one that is critical, right? But we also think it affects things like your mental well-being, whether or not you function as a society who is depressed, who wants to commit suicide. All these sorts of things are factored in at a point at which you're locked into a single system where you can only air your grievances and talk to one individual. We change all of that with a polyamorous relationship. We're very proud to propose.
Okay, thank you for your speech. I would like to call upon the member of opposition to give us a speech within 7 minutes. Here.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right.
Start.
Despite having listened to almost an hour of a debate about relationships, very little has been dedicated to what the purpose of relationships really is at the end of the day. This is what CEO is going to bring you as our framing in terms of how a world where you have the choice between different types of relationships, which includes some of the unique benefits of monogamy that polyamory can offer, as well as some of the unique ways in which polyamory can be weaponized, means that it better fulfills the purpose of relationships. What are the purpose of relationships? My rebuttal will be integrated. The first is to provide you emotional and sexual satisfaction. So there's a degree in which we can prove that there being a choice, and or like monogamy is a dominant one, whichever debate that we're choosing to have based on what Gov has challenged us on. We're going to win on that either way. And secondly, the purpose of relationships is to provide companionship throughout your life, and particularly during times of hardship. Now, let's talk about choice, right? All of OG's analysis about how different everyone is, having different preferences, having different lifestyles, having different backgrounds, means that you have to extend that to the reasonable conclusion that there are going to be some people who, one, are happy with one person, and there are going to be people who, two, have preferences where they're just not happy with being in a relationship with multiple people, right? And so when OG challenges us on this, of like what type of world we're talking about, we think it's a world where you have options to have both types of relationships. But even if we take government's push that, oh, you have to defend the status quo where monogamy is the dominant norm, right? I have a couple things to say here. First of all, we think that the choice is preserved in the status quo world that we're talking about because the norm is changing. For example, we see the increased prevalence of things like thruples on television. You can look at Shameless as a great example, which show positive characterizations of the ways in which you can engage in polyamorous relationships that are not only become positive portrayed, but are becoming pop culture trends, which means more people are hearing about them, especially kids, which means they're growing up with the perspective that this is a positive way of being able to engage in a relationship. Secondly, with the rise of queer culture. So to the extent in which queer culture already in the status quo engages with this to a larger degree, we see that the ways in which queer culture is becoming popularized through things like RuPaul, the rise of gay rights, means that people are having an increased exposure to it, are becoming more and more normalized to it, and thus in the status quo, there is more of a choice because polyamory is becoming increasingly more of an acceptable thing, right? So we think that in general, regardless of you're talking about the status quo where the choice is becoming possible, no, or if we're preferring a world where we just have like the choice between both, which I also think is valid under the motion, we think that one, having the choice just brings you more satisfaction. Different types of people with different preferences are allowed to make different choices that bring them the best level of satisfaction. Some people will prefer monogamy, some people will prefer polyamory. We think that overall this creates more happiness and more satisfaction for people, which is what the purpose of relationships are supposed to be. But secondly, we think that a lot of people won't be able to operate in their world because there is only one choice, right? So we think that people will have to engage in that choice. They'll have to enter into relationships, which O briefly mentioned, but didn't talk about why this is so significant. When you enter into a relationship where you're not happy on, even if it's consensual, you end up being unhappy, and this unhappiness breeds things like mental illness over the long term, right? You become depressed, you become anxious about your unhappiness. The ways in which it creates mental illness means you have more people suffering from these things, right? So I think you're going to see an increased amount of suicide in the government world that you're talking about because people just don't have the choice to be able to opt out. It's the only option, and they just live in it unhappily, right? Secondly, and this is also where we come above OO says like, oh, abuse is worse because people won't talk about it. We're going to come above that by saying abuse happens more because there are more abusers in a world where more people are unhappy because there's only one type of relationship to be in. When you're unhappy, when you're unsatisfied with your relationship, whether that's because of bitterness or because you just can't handle being able to be in a relationship with multiple people at once, you take it out on your partners. So government is creating a world where there's increased likelihood of just having more abusers in general, which we think is a significant impact, right? But lastly, we think that the structure of polyamory also amplifies all this unhappiness because when you're unhappy in a relationship, even if it's not like mental illness, even if it's just regular unhappiness, let alone mental illness, polyamory magnifies that. And so other people in your relationship absorb that. They take that in. They have to bear your emotional burdens, right? They're not necessarily able to make you happier because there isn't another choice in the gov world, which means that polyamory amplifies the amount of unhappiness in their world, which doesn't fulfill the purpose of relationships. The second reason why we prefer a world where there's a choice is that these relationships, you can learn from each other. We prefer a world where they both exist because people who partake in different systems can see the pros and cons of each one. And this is something that OO doesn't contextualize at all of like why the status quo is so significant is because we have both at the same time, right? So one, you're only able to make an informed choice when you understand the differences between both to a firmest degree. We don't think government world is the best type of informed choice you should prefer because there's literally only one choice. So when there's multiple choices, not right now, I'll take you in a sec, you can learn about each one. You can see the pros and cons of each one, the ways in which they interact with each other, and make a more informed decision for yourself. Secondly, people within those systems learn and improve from each other from watching other systems. So someone who's in like a polyamorous relationship and like hasn't been doing a good job at valuing their partner learns when they see their monogamous friends and the ways in which they put so much time and effort into one of the partners. Similarly, people who are obsessed with true love, which is what CEG wants to talk about, and here's where I'm engaging with them, also learn from polyamorous people in the status quo that while for some people monogamy is great, like it's not for everyone, but it's only in our world, the status quo, or in a world where we prefer both existing at the same time, where we're able to learn from the comparisons of them against each other. Not right now. Lastly, or actually I'll take opening government.
Taken.
Cool. So you tell us that there are some instances of like media representation of polyamory, but we clearly set up from opening government why entire social norms and social structures are made in a way which is unfriendly to it and broadly harmful for people in relationships. Please respond to that characterization.
I'm not sure what you're talking about because I gave reasons why it's becoming more friendly in the status quo. It's also not necessarily our burden to defend the status quo versus a world where we just prefer the choice of both at once. Moving on. So what are some of the downsides of polyamory and why is monogamy a legitimate choice, regardless if you're talking about a world where you prefer both or a world where it's like more of a norm like in the status quo, right? One, you have to compromise more. And this is something like OO alludes to, but doesn't tell you the concrete consequences of like, you have to decide like where you live based on multiple people. You have to decide like what people's work schedules are going to be based on multiple people, which means you have to compromise more on the type of lifestyle lifestyle decisions that are just more likely to make you unhappier because you're less likely to see an outcome that you prefer that is best for you, right? Similarly, you're like likely to like, as a result of that in the government world, you're likely to just devalue the relationship because like you're always having to compromise for the relationship. It's going to feel frustrating for you and you're ultimately just going to end up being unhappy with it, right? But I think the big thing here is that you just cannot get intimacy in their world. Oh, it says like, yes, polyamorous relationships have less intimacy, but the reason why that we're providing you is because intimacy comes from shared experiences over a long period of time. It's the reason why you can feel intimacy with like multiple family members, but it's more difficult to do it with multiple romantic partners because you grew up with those family members and you have a long period of shared important experiences with them. But with polyamory, you just end up having to compromise as an adult. You have limited time outside of work. Not all of your partners can be there for all of your important life events. So there's just like a two-way lack of investment with each other. And this is especially important during times of hardship. So like when like a coronavirus happens and like you're less invested in a relationship and you're less happy with all of these relationships, people are less likely to support you and you're less likely to support them, which like means two-way people are less supported and less satisfied. So I think at the end of the day, regardless of whether you're preferring the choice in general, or regardless of whether you're looking at whether monogamy is like a legitimate choice, we think that we've provided you better characterizations than OO on both of these fronts. But we largely just answer OG of like why a world like that is so shitty and why it doesn't fulfill the purpose of relationships. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to call upon the government whip to
Can
give
everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, cool.
Member of oh yeah, sure. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Opposition bench takes a concrete loss in this debate for the precise reason of their framing. C and O want to defend a choice. Oh shoot, sorry.
Start.
Sorry, my bad. Opposition bench takes a concrete loss in this debate. They frame this debate to be about choice, but note their argumentations. They have been shitting on polyamory for 21 minutes in this debate. They have a large defense of monogamy entirely. We don't understand why in their case they are able to deal with polygamy when CO literally came up and argued that polyamory is a causation of toxic relationships and abusive relationships. If you think the harm is so significant on your side of the house, why are you willing to stand for the choice of individuals on your side of the house? This is a dark bench, our primary focus on how we differentiate in this debate. But first, let's deal with closing opposition from the start. First, I'd like to know the strategic response that we have. Their analysis on how there's an increased acceptance towards polyamory relationships, i.e. through shameless, i.e. through pop culture and media, is concession that a lot of individuals actually realizing that polyamory is good, which means all the harms that they want to talk about and push about are actually things in status quo which people are able to deal with. More analysis specifically on how those harms are structurally dealt with in my speech later on. But the second, the argument of the purpose of relationships doesn't really matter because of a lack of impact. We think a relationship fulfills you. The fact that you have different individuals have different intrinsic forms of happiness, and i.e. how people find happiness from different things, for example, it is impossible structurally for a single individual for you to forget all their happiness from. Note specifically, there's no structural defense of monogamy on side opposition when it comes towards happiness. All they have been on about was how polygamy was bad. No one else knows monogamy should structurally be the norm, considering John specifically told you about the ranges of things which people find happiness from and how polygamy is the exclusive platform in which you're able to access those choices and access that form of happiness. Second, on unhappy relationships, and here's where closing opposition literally kill themselves. In monogamy, you are forced to stay within an unhappy relationship because you believe, as in on their words, it's about sacrificing things for your partner. So individuals are more likely to continue making absolutely horrible sacrifices which detriment their own self-interest and their own perception of happiness because they believe in monogamy, that they believe that this is their true significant other on our side of the house. Even in the worst case scenario on unhappy relationships, at worst on our side, you get an extended time frame which you're subjecting individuals to unnecessary torment. You're subjecting them to horrible divorces because divorces only happen when there's truly the last straw in those unhappy relationships. But the second, the positive contribution and flipping it against opposition is that we are the unhappy relationships are likely better solved on our side of the house precisely because of John's analysis. That is, you feel unhappy because you feel as though you're not being fully satisfied and you feel as though it's on your partner to satisfy you as an individual. We think having a range of partners and a consensual level, which I'll analyze later in my speech, encourages individuals to be more happy and to be more accepting of individuals, including their flaws, overall having a better, happy society on our side of the house. Let us deal with opening opposition. I think my POI clearly took opening opposition out of this debate. The framing must be contingent on the arguments. If they have all the arguments premised upon the harms of polygamy, they cannot defend polygamy as a choice at all. Second, they defend a context of conservative societies and how polygamy is extremely harmful in circumstances. This is an absolute wash. This includes opening context of liberalizing societies as well. Because in conservative societies, individuals in your side of the house, regardless of polygamy, are still likely to devalue their wives as a whole. This means that they'll likely do things like cheating, i.e. do things like having mistresses, that even when confronted by their wife, they're unlikely to take it too hard. They're unlikely to care about these issues because they've been born in their specific context of having a patriarchal norm, or that's an overarching parallel narrative on your side of the house. This entire harm is a wash on both sides of the house and cannot be applicable in this debate. In order for this debate to talk about the best ways in which you're able to fulfill happiness, this has to operate on a fair medium ground, which means individuals should be free of like choosing relationships on or like as a whole. Later so now on to characterizing opposition's harms, right? They argue jealousy, they argue resources. Consensual relationships directly deal with all these issues because these are individuals that likely talk through things before they enter these relationships. These problems are likely things in which individuals are able to talk about. And even in the worst case scenario, when you compare the scale of that harm, you compare the scale of jealousy, the scale of resources to the amount of torment you suffer, you put on individuals. And later in my speech, I also talk about why you worsen toxic relationships and abuse, which are a direct result of monogamy as a whole. But the second, they are comparative of friends being alternative. This is a direct concession of how your side of the house actually has a lot of individuals that can find happiness and meaning by having a deeper relationship from another individual that is not your one true significant other, right? When you consider that friends can give you happiness, we think you torment individuals on two ways. A, they're not able to fully extend their happiness. This happens a lot when individuals develop sexual tensions with their close friends and best friends because they've always been there for these individuals. You stop them from fully actualizing their happiness because they must believe in this idea that monogamy is truly the one true way. But the second, you also suffer from a lot of torment whenever you're questioning yourself or whether you want to kiss your significant other, kiss your friend in a circumstance because you're completely bound by polygamy. Second main issue, and this is where primarily the impacts of closing government comes in, is how this normative effect literally creates more toxic relationships in general. We think in relationships that are abusive, i.e. Stockholm syndrome, i.e. abusive relationships, they originate upon the idea of monogamy, and the only reason why they continue existing with a lack of regulation and a lack of checks and balances is literally because of monogamy. Before I move on, I'll take
Taken.
Okay, so all of your analysis about like lack of a choice directly knifes your own comparative, right? You don't have a choice out of polyamorous relationships for people who this might not be the best option for them for. And we also gave specific reasons why monogamous relationships have better benefits. So even if it's a comparative of polyamory versus monogamous, engage with it versus dismissing every benefit of monogamy that CO has provided.
That is your job on your side of the house. We told you why individuals don't have a fixed standard of happiness in which one individual can fully fulfill. You need to deal with the analysis. It is your burden to tell us why monogamy is significantly better. Whatever benefits you give, I've already compared in terms of scale of benefit and scale of harm. Deal with those comparatives and don't be convenient on side opposition. On toxic relationships, we think they originate upon the idea of monogamy, right? People continue to be submissive and be abused because monogamy tells them it's their responsibility to satisfy your partner's needs, to be the ones who sacrifices a lot of individuals' rights and freedoms in order to fulfill the monogamy relationship, the monogamous relationship in which you want to defend on your side of the house. Second, you're unlikely to report because monogamy supports the idea that your relationship has a lot of sanctity between one another, and if you report it to your closest friend, for example, it's violating the sanctity of the relationship and violating the trust of your partner. You're being unfaithful, and that's what directly drives individuals who are in abusive relationships away from talking to individuals and away from reporting these incidents. Monogamy directly perpetuates the narrative of internally resoluting issues, which means a lot of problems don't actually end up being voiced out, and this is the main issue on our side of the house. Opening only told you, oh, there are support structures. Simply having more people means you're able to solve it better, right? We categorically analyze why monogamy in of itself is the sole causations of this issue, why it's oppressive and why it should stop. On opposition, what we needed from them was a direct defense of monogamy. Why is it okay to shackle an individual to a single person and expect them to derive all their happiness from it when it could result in a lot of toxic relationships and unsatisfied and unhappy individuals? On our side of the house, we are proud to defend a world where people are more happy and there are less toxic relationships that cause a lot of harms and sufferings to people on the ground. Proud to propose.
Okay, thank you for your speech. I would like to call upon Opposition Whip to close this debate within 7 minutes. Here.
Can't hear.
Can people hear me now?
Here.
All right, perfect. Okay.
Start.
Government bench is not entirely clear to me in terms of what debate they wanted to have. Is it polygamy versus monogamy, or would they want polyamory only versus the coexistence of different types of relationships? As closing opposition, we're dynamic, we'll engage both frames and win them all. I have three issues that I want to flag down. First, the issue of coexistence. Second, the issue of domestic relationships, more nuanced on children. But lastly, on the idea of the purpose of romantic relationships and where is it better in what world comparatively. Let's first talk about coexistence, because opening government talked about the disadvantages of monogamy, while opening opposition talked about the disadvantages of polygamy. But opening house analyzes things that were valid, but misses the whole question of the debate. And the question of the debate is, should polygamy and polyamory and monogamy coexist, or should it only be polygamy alone? We don't think that there were fair analysis or weighing or comparisons of the opening houses at the end. We think the harms coming from opening government in terms of divorce, toxic relationships, codependency is something that is not mutually exclusive to polyamorous relationships. We think that, mutually exclusive to those types of relationships. What did Josh say about the coexistence of both types of relationships? His first analysis, which wasn't talked about by government whip, was the idea that there are certain advantages from monogamy and polygamy, and it's better for us as a society to learn from those particular advantages so that we can integrate those types of learnings from different types of relationships. So we think that's a holistic point of view. But secondly, totally unresponsive coming from government whip, is that people can calculate where they are happier, but not happier. People can calculate where they are also healthier at the end of the day. It has already been established that polyamory is not something that would be healthy for everyone. We think that choice exists, and that's an exclusive contribution coming from closing opposition. But lastly, Josh talked about that there's just less options to escape different abusers. An added layer of analysis is to say that even if people can shift to different types of polyamorous relationships, abusers can also be there. In comparison to, you can have the option to make sure whether or not one person is abusive or not. That's the first issue. We think we want the issue of coexistence. What is the second issue that I'd like to flag down? It's the idea of domestic relationships where children are better off. But before I go on to that second issue, I'll take a POI, and my only POI, I'll take
Taken.
So we tell you why, in a world where there are only polyamorous relationships, social norms exist in a different way, which means, for instance, that family relations are much more communal, which means there are established norms of social support and of communication. That, as far as I can tell, has received no response in this debate so far, and clearly responds to the material that you were talking about norms and about choice.
Yeah, the reason why it has less responses than you expected is because opening government had to characterize what does the normalized new social norms are, rather than assuming that there is and we already get what you already mean. But that's a good segue to my second issue in terms of domestic relationships, because the argument of opening government is that children are better off only with analysis that they have more parents to take care of the children. We think, number one, that that's not true, that more parents are likely to not neglect their children anymore, for two main reasons. First, we think that in polyamorous relationships where that only exists, no one will feel solely responsible, which means there's the idea of buck passing of responsibility, knowing someone else can take care of their children. One case study that we want to talk about is the murder of Kitty Genovese in Queens, New York in 1964. It's flagged in Super Freakonomics, where the police interviewed everyone in the neighborhood if they heard a woman getting murdered, and all said yes, but no one bothered to call the police because everyone assumed that there were a lot of people ready who have already done so. That means in even the domestic relationships that happen in opening government side, parents are also even willing to walk at these things that their children are taken care of because of the quantity of people that can be responsible. But even if in our side, if monogamy is the only thing that existed, parents will feel solely responsible, that makes them personally sure that their children are taken care of. In our paradigm, at least we know who is to be held legally and criminally liable for child neglect. In opening government's house, and even entire government's house, we wouldn't know who would be solely responsible. Therefore, there would be no natural incentive to make sure that your child is there. Government paradigm also is like derivative, because like if there are more parents who will take care of more children of those children, then there will be more children that will need parents. So we think that it just doesn't accrue all the benefits instead, because we used to have little children. No, thank you. Let's go on to my last and final issue. Why we win against closing government in terms of the purpose of romantic relationships. Coming from closing government, they said that we need to value diversity because sometimes you only appreciate the face of the person, sex, or the money. We think we won this debate based on the characterization of Josh saying, what is the purpose of romantic relationships? And we talked about emotional fulfillment, because in government's paradigm, we won't be used to accepting people for who they are and who they are not if we can just keep replacing different aspects of our needs. People will be picky on what to accept on an individual. So that's what happens in closing government. There's one girlfriend for pleasure, one boyfriend for money, and one boyfriend for your debate circuit, whatever, right? Why is this particularly pernicious? Because there will be a norm that people are not fully accepted for who they are and who they are not. People are not accepted for their faults at the end of the day. What did Josh say? Josh said that the purpose of romantic relationships is for emotional fulfillment. It only happens when someone is fully accepted for their faults at the end of the day. I would not be happy if my future girlfriend or boyfriend would only accept me as a loved one only because I'm insanely handsome. Of course, I want to be accepted for our faults. In our side, people are driven to develop the art of contentment and fulfillment to love unconditionally. In our side, that unconditional love that can exist in monogamous relationships is likelier to be transferred also to polyamorous relationships. The conclusion of this last issue is that it's likelier for people to love unconditionally because we have those different strengths of different types of relationships where we can carry around all of them, and we think our society is more loving when choices exist. We are very proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you all debaters for